Hi, it's Brad. Thank you so much for listening to AJFF In Conversation, the Jewish Film Podcast. My co-host Sara and I, like everyone at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, are so grateful for your support. Whether you subscribed in your podcast app or are leaving us ratings and reviews, every little bit helps. What perhaps helps more than anything, though, is your financial support. We cannot do the podcast or any of our other virtual programs without the generous contributions of listeners like you. If you're willing and if you're able, please consider supporting the podcast with a donation at ajff.org/inconversation. Thank you so much, and now, please enjoy the episode.
Hi, I'm Sara Glassberg, and this is AJFF In Conversation, the Jewish Film Podcast. Since we are getting closer to our annual festival, we wanted to take another peek behind the curtain, so to speak, of the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, specifically guest programming. Whether you have attended our festival in the past, or you've even just listened to certain discussions that we've had about our festival on this podcast, you likely know by now that sparking dialogue and fostering community through cinema is tantamount to AJFF's mission. A big part of how we do that is through guest speakers, who provide invaluable context and background through introductory remarks before films, and who moderate talkbacks and Q&As with filmmakers and talent, but also other experts after. But how exactly do these speakers enhance the film-going experience at AJFF and set that experience apart from other movie-watching experiences? Why are guest speakers so important to AJFF? And what are some of the philosophical and logistical factors that go into guest programming, from determining which films warrant facilitated discussion afterwards to selecting who those speakers will be? With me today to unpack some of these questions and share some of their personal insights and experiences with guest speaking at AJFF are two of our guest programming committee co-chairs, Dave Schechter and Jonathan Crane. Dave Schechter is a freelance journalist whose work includes a regular column and in-depth articles for the Atlanta Jewish Times. And Jonathan Crane is the Raymond F. Shinazi Scholar of Bioethics and Jewish Thought at the Ethics Center at Emory University, who publishes and speaks on Jewish ethical perspectives on biomedical, social, political, and warfare issues, among other topics. Dave, Jonathan, thank you so much for being with me today. So you both have served and then co-chaired this committee for a number of years. And obviously I work on guest programming from the staff side of things. So clearly this aspect of AJFF's mission is something that speaks, no pun intended, to each of us really. So I would actually just love to start with what inspired you personally to both, become involved with this committee and this process. So Dave, I'm going to start with you, and then Jonathan, I'd love to hear your story as well.
Well, Sarah, I went back and looked in my email, and I have been on this committee for at least a decade, judging from the email content I have. I don't know who invited me to join the committee, but I suppose it was because at the time I worked for CNN and because I had worked in the Middle East, including in Israel, and I was asked to join at a time when the committee was smaller. The meetings were being held over at the American Jewish Committee office, and I've enjoyed it from the very first time. It's always been a fun group, and it's always been good conversation, and it's always been educational. So that's my background with it.
Sara, thank you. I don't remember who invited me either to participate in this committee. I've been involved for far less than Dave. For about perhaps 4 or 5 years now. I have found that the committee is a great place to meet a variety of different folks from across the Atlanta Jewish community and beyond. And the professionalism of the staff has made it so incredibly smooth to explore these films and think about ways that they can have a meaningful impact in the broader Atlanta community.
Well, I think that, Jonathan, that segues into something I wanted to talk to you about specifically. So you mentioned that seeing these films up close, meeting all of these different people who form the kind of brain trust of the committee itself, and just thinking about how can we create a larger impact with these films in the community. And so clearly we all know and we all think that guest speakers are effective ways of doing that, of enhancing the films. But I guess I just want to hear from you, Jonathan, as to like what a little bit more on that. What value do guest speakers really add for the audience? Why are they so important? What role do they play in obviously the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival has these other goals of creating conversation and understanding among the audience through film. So are there specific examples that you could think of in your experience or that you've witnessed over the years being involved of how guest speakers really add that value and create that impact?
Well, first and foremost, certainly the guest speakers provide insight into the films, and they frame how they at least understand the significance of the film that the audience is about to encounter. They also provide, depending on the individuals who are invited to speak, they provide expertise in the subject matter that perhaps most audience members might not have. They also could very well be involved in the film itself. So the experience of developing the film, of acting in it, directing it, or doing the research behind it, those provide angles and perspectives on the film that audience members wouldn't have access to. And so the guest speakers can provide a rich array of perspectives, angles, and cracks into the film that enrich the audience's appreciation of its significance. And also, for some of the films, there's a personal connection to the community. So last year, we had the opportunity to have the films, one of the films on Jewish-Black relations. And many of the significant characters in that film are local. And they were able to participate in the conversations, opening and also closing out that film. And that provides community members an opportunity to connect individually with the people on the screen as well as on the stage.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with all of that. I mean, I think there's two aspects of guest programming, right? There's the bringing in talent, filmmakers. That's obviously very exciting. And then there's really enriching the films with experts from the community. I know for me personally, I knew at some point today, I wanted to just mention that there are obviously unique challenges that come with guest speaking and with our side of things, programming that. I know that 2 years ago now, we had a horror film that I've spoken about on this podcast called The Golem. And because I had sort of academic experience in that, I was able to do kind of a staff introduction and pull out aspects of that film that weren't really being talked about by other guest speakers that we had, just because I was coming at it from a different lens. So that actually brings me, Dave, to a question that I want to throw to you first about those unique challenges and considerations, because obviously when we're talking about who should introduce a film or who should be a panelist or a moderator for a Q&A, there are usually so many different angles, right, that we can so many different aspects of the film that we could pull out. So let's talk a little bit about how those determinations are made and what that landscape is of just kind of finding the right expert or finding someone that could speak to particular nuggets from a film.
Well, let me say this. I'm about to echo a few things Jonathan already said in this regard. The staff from Kenny Blank on down has the unenviable task of determining, how many times a film will be screened, determining whether we want an intro for this film or both an introduction and a Q&A afterwards. So that is the first consideration. Then the issue comes of, let's take the introduction. The challenge there, as Jonathan said, is the person doing an introduction should pique the audience interest, but without giving away the story, which means that you want someone who either as recognized experience or, as Jonathan said, to expertise in the subject of the film, or someone with a unique personal tie to the subject. The challenge then comes in of making sure you've got that person available when you want them, number one. And number two, there are films that the festival has run 3, 4, 5 times, which means you need to find 1, 2, 3, 4 or more people who can deliver good, interesting introductions. Now, when you get to the other end of the film, the same challenge presents itself. It's just multiplied because you want to have a conversation with people who either have expertise in the subject or who have as I said, a unique personal tie, so that the audience is gaining some value added from the whole experience, not just the film, but the coming into the film, going out of the film. But again, as we on the committee come up with dozens and dozens of ideas, which we then, Sarah, leave for you, and in the past, Catherine, Dina, and others, to try and figure out if the logistics will work in order to make those ideas come to fruition.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance. And I know, in the past, at least, there were these multiple opportunities to have those different angles represented. And, we're certainly going to look at all of the expanded opportunities in virtual for guest speakers and to allow for audiences to have those different kinds of expertise, represented. And it's going to be exciting, but also very different. Jonathan, did you have any thoughts on this question about kind of prioritizing one avenue or approach to contextualizing the film over others or anything like that?
So in normal times, there are the logistical challenges of getting individual people to present and open and respond to various films. And so therefore, there we need to rely upon the magical wisdom of the professional staff at AJFF to figure out those logistics. But now with this coming year's opportunity for the film festival, we can bring in folks to participate from all over the world. And so this pandemic has offered us an unusual opportunity to enrich our appreciation by bringing in even more diverse scholars and leaders and participants in the films.
One of the things that has changed in the committee over the years has been the committee has become much more diverse. It's become more diverse within the religious spectrum of the Jewish community. It's become more diverse within the demographic spectrum of Atlanta itself. And that brings different perspectives from members of the committee, open up avenues for ideas about how to present a film and who should present a film that we might not have had in years past. So that the diversity of the committee does lead, I think, to greater diversity in the guests that we invite.
I think that's absolutely true. It's a really good point. So I want to pivot a little bit. We've been talking, I would say, mainly about introductions. And I'm so glad that we covered the basis of, how do we get audiences excited for the film they're about to see without spoilers? But now I want to kind of segue a little bit into what happens after and those conversations, the post-film talkbacks and Q&As. Jonathan, I'm going to start with you, but then Dave, I'd love to hear your ideas as well on what kind of films do you think warrant or lend themselves most to Q&As? I know that there's a lot of, it's eventually up to the AJFF staff. And in the past, of course, we used to have to think about logistical concerns, right? In a particular venue, clearing out the theater, is there time for a Q&A? But from the kind of philosophical angle, what kinds of films do we tend to prioritize at AJFF for Q&As? Why are Q&As so important for those kinds of films? And of course, any specific examples that you could think of, and of course, thinking also about what audiences really gain from those post-film discussions. So Dave, I'm going to go to you after I hear from Jonathan on this question.
So the Q&As after films, I think, are an incredibly important opportunity for community engagement. I have found that the films that are best suited for those kinds of engagements are those that provide unusual perspectives on familiar topics or issues. It could very well be that the topic might be a controversial figure, a historical figure or time in Jewish history, but it's those films that provide a unique perspective or a different kind of angle or avenue to appreciate those things that are otherwise well known, that pique and provoke community engagement. And the Q&A is an opportunity for a scholar, a leader, somebody who's involved with the film to respond to communal questions and investigations on why those particular angles on that particular topic were developed and presented in this film this particular way. So not only are Q&As great for unusual perspectives on familiar topics, they're also really useful for those films that are exploring ethically complex dilemmas, whether those dilemmas are religious in nature or bioethical or social. This is a time for the community to wrestle with those dilemmas. The film has provided one narrative to examine those particular issues, but the Q&A then allows for the community to bring those issues into the contemporary moment and into the Atlanta scene itself. And it allows for us a chance to have meaningful conversations amongst ourselves, and often facilitated by somebody who's trained in those particular arenas. I remember having the chance to talk with a community about not an experiment so much as experiences that were had by twins, and that was done through some orphanages here in the United States. And it was an opportunity for us to examine and discuss the ethical issues about experimentation on children, on the values that can be derived from that kind of information, and what it says about Jewish approaches to parenthood and adoption. It was a very powerful set of conversations that I think would have been left in the foyer had the Q&A session not been allowed and facilitated.
Sara, I would say, coming on the back of what Jonathan just said, Jonathan taking his professional world into this, discussing films with particular ethical concerns. I'll take from the journalistic sense, films that are controversial subjects, particularly documentaries, but also films that might have a slightly fictionalized account but of real events are good candidates for, the post-film Q&A. I thought of two examples in advance. One, last year, the festival screened a film called Ma'abarot, about the transit camps that Israel built for Jewish emigres from North Africa and the Middle East in the late 1940s and the 1950s into the 1960s. This is a subject which many consider to be a stain on Israel's history, a sin committed by the government and the way that these emigres were handled. But this is a story that's mostly unknown to a largely Ashkenazic audience. And after the film, we had a local historian who was expert on aspects of Israeli history, and a gentleman who had lived in one of these camps. And I could see from the stage that there were people in the audience who were still slightly disbelieving of what they had seen on the screen, that this was how one set of Jews had treated another set of Jews as they came to Israel. The other example that came to mind was about 5 years ago. There was a film about the last day of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's life. It was basically centered on the assassination of Rabin by Yigal Amir, a right-wing Jewish extremist in Israel. Now, I had encountered Rabin while I worked in Israel in the mid-1980s, and I had been sent to Israel after his assassination. And the guests were people who were either familiar with Rabin or people who knew that period and understood the dynamics of why the settler movement from which Amir was spawned, why there was such anger with Rabin. So the audience in both of these cases, Ma'abarot and Yitzhak Rabin, leaves the theater possibly saying, I did not know about that. That's an interesting way to look at it. And if I ever have the chance to talk about this subject with anyone else, I know something now that I might not have known before. So I think those Q&As provide, as Jonathan said, a really unique experience, an opportunity for the audience to not only reflect on the film, but to learn something beyond what they've just seen up on the screen.
And I think that they also allowed the local community to build on what they have just learned and apply the historical facts that they might not have otherwise known or known in that particular way and say, this speaks to the contemporary moment here in Atlanta, and provide them an opportunity to make that connection between that historical circumstance or the ethical circumstance and see how it's being lived out here and now.
I think that's fascinating. I mean, one example that I'll just throw into something that I observed, I guess it was 2 years ago now, my first festival on staff, there was a guest we were going to fly in who is one of the subjects or sort of people featured in this one documentary. And I think that what happened was he was ill or he couldn't make it. The details around that were a little hazy because in the moment it was more of a logistical concern. But then I kind of was able to pull back and see that what happened was the intro speaker who was meant to also moderate the Q&A, because there was not going to be a Q&A any longer, they actually just all migrated out into the lobby of the theater. And there are photos of this that are in, one of the galleries on AJFF.org of this speaker just kind of sitting at one of these tables at one of the Regal theaters with people from the audience that decided to stay. It was late at night too, and they all kind of just crowded around him, and they had this intimate post-film talk back. And I don't know for sure. I wasn't close enough to kind of listen in, but was observing from a distance. But Jonathan, I would imagine that what you're speaking to was very much a part of that, kind of taking this, that what the audience had just seen and just trying to process it with I think it was a rabbi in the local community who was leading that, and just it was a really remarkable moment. So I have two kind of closing questions. The first, I'm just going to ask Dave your thoughts on this, and we have sort of been addressing this a little bit as we've gone along, this question of what really makes a good guest speaker. And I think you could take that question different ways depending on intro or Q&A, or maybe it's the same set of criteria, but we've talked about personal experience versus kind of knowledge or expertise. But Dave, I would just love to hear what you think makes a good guest speaker for AJFF.
Well, I'll speak to my own experience. But first I want to say what you just said about conversations out in the lobby. I have witnessed this almost every year, that someone who's been a speaker in a Q&A comes out to the lobby, and they may be figuring they're headed for their car, and they're not going to get to their car because there's 5, 10, 15 people out in the lobby who want to continue the conversation. I have witnessed this on multiple occasions, and it's one of the more gratifying sights, because you think, okay, we booked the right speaker. We found the right person, because this conversation has continued out beyond the theater. I don't know how many films I've done introductions for. I haven't counted them up. But when you asked if there's particular personal experience, as I said, an intro speaker should have knowledge of a subject or a unique personal tie to it. A couple of years ago, the festival screened a movie about the Cairo Geniza, the depository of books and papers in the Jewish community in Cairo, dating over a period of hundreds of years. And this is a story in which my great-grandfather was a central figure because it was he who had done much of the unearthing of this material. Well, I was asked to do the intro, which I confess I had lobbied for, and it turned out to be the first intro that the festival had done at the Byers Theater at City Springs in Sandy Springs. And I can tell you that when I stepped up to the microphone and looked at the enormity of that room, it was slightly intimidating because I've done them at smaller theaters where there's a couple of hundred people there and it's a little more intimate. But the reason that intro stands out to me beyond all others was that not only was it a subject I knew about, not only was there a personal tie to it, but I was able to do that intro in front of my wife and my children, but also my mother and one of my sisters who had come in from Chicago specifically for that event. So the fact, in that sense, I will never do an intro that will have any greater personal resonance than that one. So, that to me, I was able to combine what I knew and the personal tie. I told a couple of stories that I think were funny that people laughed at. And I was relatively glad to get off the stage at that point and back into the audience where the lights were turned down. But, the guest speakers, I think they should get something out of this as much as the audience, because they get the chance to convey not just information, hard data, but they get the chance to convey something of an emotional content to the subject, because they are guiding the audience into the film and perhaps in a Q&A, guiding the audience out of the film. So, I would think that for the speakers, if we do a good job of identifying and they're available, it's a unique experience for them as well, I hope.
I want to echo that. I had the opportunity to introduce a film about a religious community in upstate New York. And I had to do a lot of research and watch the film several times to figure out what I wanted to say and how I wanted to say it, how to frame the film. The chance to open up and introduce a film empowers me, and I would imagine many other guest speakers, an opportunity to think afresh about a film and its content area in ways that we might not otherwise were we just members of the audience.
Well, I think that actually is probably a perfect place to end. I mean, I'll just open up one more closing question if either of you have further thoughts on how guest speakers set AJFF apart from just going to the movies or watching something at home. And the reason I say I'm just opening this up, if you have further thoughts, is because I think we've been treading along those lines throughout this conversation. But if you have closing thoughts on that, Dave, and then Jonathan.
Well, we have pretty much gone over various angles of that. I have found it gratifying when I have done an intro or I have moderated a panel, and I'll get an email, I'll get a text message, or someone will come up to me the next time I go to a film during that festival and say, hey, I liked your intro, or that was a really good discussion. Then I know that the audience has gotten something other than sitting down in their seat, watching the film, getting up out of their seat and leaving. And I think, as Jonathan said earlier, and as you've said, Sarah, the unique circumstance for 2021 of the virtual world will provide, it'll be different, no question about that. It's different from our discussion process all the way through the booking process, I'm sure. But it will give the audience, as I said earlier, something that's value added to the film itself.
I would say that these guest speakers demonstrate that film is more than entertainment. They show that film is an avenue to insight, to meaning, connection, and perhaps most important, to community. And that is something that AJFF provides par excellence.
Point to end it on. I mean, thank you both again for being with me today. This conversation has made me think of a lot of, again, things I've observed with regard to guest speaking at the festival, things I've had a hand in, my own experience introducing a horror film, which was certainly magical in the ways that you've described. So I just can't thank you both enough. And yeah, we have a lot of exciting, unique opportunities and things in store in the works for 2021. So everyone should definitely just subscribe to our email list at ajff.org and not want to miss any updates from us about what we're working on with some fabulous guest programming for 2021. Thank you again, Dave and Jonathan, so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
No, thank you very much.
As always, I'm Sara Glassberg. Producing and editing the show is our technical director, Chris Holland, and my co-host is Brad Pilcher. The music you've been hearing throughout the episode is by the incredibly talented Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music. Thank you again to today's special guests, Dave Schechter and Jonathan Crane, 2 out of our 3 wonderful guest programming committee co-chairs at AJFF. You will find show notes and much more from us at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a question or a comment. We might just include you on a future episode. And don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, a review. Every little bit helps. And last but certainly not least, we cannot continue to do this podcast or any of our other virtual programs without your support. If you are willing and able, please make a donation at ajff.org/inconversation. And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.